On the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South in Manhattan, there stands a building that has witnessed more wealth, more scandal, and more American ambition than almost any structure in the country. The Plaza Hotel. 19 stories of French Renaissance architecture rising above Central Park. 282 feet of gleaming white facade punctuated by mansard roofs and ornate balconies. A building so expensive to construct that its original owners nearly went bankrupt before the doors even opened. So lavish in its appointments that a single suite cost more per night than most Americans earned in a year. The plaza opened on October 1st, 1907, and from that first evening it represented something more than accommodation. It was a statement, a declaration that New York had arrived as a world capital worthy of Europe's greatest cities. Within its walls, presidents would negotiate, celebrities would scandalously misbehave, fortunes would be made and lost over dinner, marriages would begin and end within the same chandelier-lit ballrooms. But the plaza was never meant to last. The economics didn't work. They never really have. The building has teetered on the edge of financial disaster more times than anyone wants to count. It has been bought, sold, gutted, restored, converted, and reconverted. Demolition has been seriously discussed. Bankruptcy has been filed. For a building that represents permanence and stability in the American imagination, the plaza has survived through sheer, stubborn refusal to disappear. This is the story of a hotel that became a symbol that almost collapsed under its own weight. Understanding. The plaza requires understanding the city that made it possible, and that city, in the early 1900s, was transforming faster than any place on Earth. But before there was a plaza, before there was even a reason to build anything at that corner, there was just empty land at the edge of a city that hadn't yet learned how big it would become. The land where the plaza stands was once a swamp at the edge of civilization. In the early 1800s, Fifth Avenue ended at 59th Street. Beyond that stretched empty lots, rocky outcrops, and the tangled wilderness that New Yorkers avoided unless absolutely necessary. The area was known for squatters' shacks, roaming livestock, and the occasional desperate criminal hiding from the law. Property values were nearly worthless. Nobody wanted to live that far north. Nobody saw any reason to. The city's wealthy elite clustered downtown, near the financial district and the established neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan. Moving north meant leaving behind infrastructure, society, and safety. The land that would eventually host the plaza was considered frontier territory, too far from civilization to be practical, too close to be romantic. Everything changed in 1858 when the city began constructing Central Park. The project was controversial from the start. Critics argued that New York didn't need 843 acres of parkland in the middle of nowhere. They said the money would be better spent on schools or roads, or literally anything other than trees and grass where nobody lived. The total cost was projected at $5 million, an astronomical sum that many politicians considered wasteful. Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux won the design competition with their greensward plan. They envisioned a landscape that would bring nature into the urban environment, providing an escape from the crowded, dirty streets of Lower Manhattan. The plan called for artificial lakes, winding paths, meadows, and forests, all carefully designed to appear natural while serving specific recreational purposes. Construction employed thousands of workers. They blasted rock, moved millions of cubic yards of soil, and planted more than 270,000 trees and shrubs. The project took nearly 2 decades to complete, and as the park took shape, something unexpected happened. The land surrounding it suddenly became the most desirable real estate in the city. Wealthy families who had resisted moving north changed their minds. If they built at the park's edge, they could enjoy private mansions with views of green space, something impossible in the cramped downtown neighborhoods. The Vanderbilts were among the first to recognize the opportunity. They purchased land along Fifth Avenue in the 60s and began constructing the massive townhouses that would become known as Vanderbilt Row. By 1880, Fifth Avenue north of 59th Street was transforming into Millionaire's Row. The Astors built there. The Whitneys erected mansions that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Goulds, the Carnegies, the Fricks, all of New York's industrial fortunes were represented by increasingly elaborate homes. The neighborhood became a competition in architectural one-upmanship, each family trying to outdo the others in scale and opulence. The intersection of Fifth Avenue and 59th Street, the southeast corner of Central Park, became the most visible location in this new wealthy district. Every carriage traveling north on Fifth Avenue passed that corner. Anyone entering or leaving the park through the Grand Army Plaza entrance would see whatever stood there. It was prime real estate for anyone who understood that visibility mattered as much as location. A businessman named Eugene Harrier recognized the opportunity before most others. In the late 1880s, he began assembling parcels of land at that corner. His vision was straightforward. New York's wealthy families needed somewhere to stay when they came to the city from their country estates. They needed a hotel that matched their status, something more refined than the commercial establishments downtown. The first Plaza Hotel opened in 1890. Harrier had hired the architectural firm of J.B. Snook and Sons to design it. The result was respectable, but not spectacular. 8 stories of brick construction with white marble trim. The building featured 400 rooms, which seemed enormous at the time. A restaurant occupied the ground floor. The upper stories contained guest rooms and a few permanent residential suites for families who chose to live in the hotel year-round. The original plaza succeeded almost immediately. The location was perfect. Wealthy families staying there could walk to their Fifth Avenue mansions. They could stroll through Central Park. They could host dinners in the hotel's private dining rooms, entertaining guests without the burden of maintaining a full Manhattan household. For families who spent most of the year at country estates, the arrangement was ideal. The hotel's success reflected broader changes in New York society. The city was exploding with wealth from industrial fortunes. The 1880s and 90s were the peak of the Gilded Age, when men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan accumulated wealth on a scale America had never seen. These fortunes needed somewhere to go. Some of it went into mansions, some into art collections, some into luxury hotels where the wealthy could gather and demonstrate their status. The city itself was growing at an unprecedented rate. New York's population doubled between 1880 and 1890, passing 1.5 million residents. The invention of the elevator made tall buildings practical. Steel frame construction allowed structures to rise higher than ever before. The city was reaching upward and outward simultaneously, transforming from a compact commercial port into a true metropolis. But by 1902, Harrier's original plaza looked inadequate. 15 years had passed since its construction. New hotels were opening across the city, each trying to claim the title of New York's finest. The Waldorf had opened in 1893, designed by Henry Hardenberg in the German Renaissance style. The Astoria opened next door in 1897, and the two were connected to form the Waldorf Astoria, instantly becoming the largest and most prestigious hotel in the world. Other competitors were rising. The St. Regis opened in 1904, built by John Jacob Astor IV who spared no expense in creating what he considered the finest hotel in America. The St. Regis featured lavish interiors, modern conveniences like air cooling systems, and service standards that set new benchmarks for luxury hospitality. If the original plaza was going to remain competitive, it needed to be completely rebuilt on a scale that would make every other hotel look modest by comparison. A German-born financier named Bernhard Beinecke recognized both the problem and the opportunity. Beinecke had immigrated to America as a young man and built a fortune through banking and real estate speculation. He understood money, he understood New York, and he understood that the city was entering a period of explosive growth that would reward audacious investments. Beinecke studied the hotel market carefully. The Waldorf Astoria was profitable, but landlocked, unable to expand. The St. Regis was new, but on a less visible location. The original plaza sat on the single best hotel site in Manhattan, the corner that every wealthy New Yorker passed regularly, the gateway to Central Park, the symbolic entrance to Millionaire's Row. Whoever controlled that corner controlled the most valuable piece of hospitality real estate in America. He approached Harrier with an offer. Beinecke would purchase the Plaza Hotel and the land beneath it. Harrier would walk away with a substantial profit. Beinecke would then demolish the existing structure and construct something that would eclipse every hotel in the world. The conversation happened in 1904. By early 1905, Beinecke had assembled a syndicate of investors and completed the purchase for approximately $3 million. The syndicate included some of New York's wealthiest men. Fred Sterry, who would later manage the new hotel, invested. John bet $1 million. Gates, a steel magnate famous for his gambling and speculation, put money into the project. Harry S. Black, president of the Fuller Construction Company, joined the syndicate both as investor and as the man whose company would build the new structure. These men understood that they weren't just building a hotel. They were creating a monument to New York's arrival as a world capital. Beinecke's vision was clear from the start. The new plaza would be twice the size of the original. It would rise 18 stories when most buildings topped out at 10 or 12. It would feature the finest materials money could buy, imported from Europe if necessary. The interiors would rival the palaces of European royalty. Every detail would communicate that New York had reached a level of sophistication equal to London, Paris, or Vienna. The choice of architect was critical. Beinecke needed someone who understood grand hotels, someone who could design on a monumental scale while maintaining the intimate luxury that wealthy guests expected. He chose Henry Janeway Hardenberg, the man who had designed the original Waldorf Astoria and established himself as America's preeminent hotel architect. Hardenberg was 58 years old in 1905, at the peak of his career and reputation. He had designed numerous prominent buildings across Manhattan. He understood structural engineering, having worked with steel frame construction since its earliest days. More importantly, he understood the psychology of luxury. He knew how to create spaces that made wealthy people feel appropriately pampered and impressed. His design for the plaza drew inspiration from French chateaux, particularly those along the Loire Valley. The style was French Renaissance, characterized by steep mansard roofs, elaborate dormer windows, and ornate facades that communicated both elegance and permanence. The building would be clad in white brick and marble, a deliberate choice that would make it stand out against the brownstone and limestone buildings surrounding it. Hardenberg proposed a U-shaped floor plan with the open end facing Grand Army Plaza and Fifth Avenue. This configuration was brilliant for several reasons. It maximized the number of rooms with park views, increasing the percentage of premium accommodations. It created an interior courtyard that could serve as a light well, bringing natural light deep into the building. And it presented an impressive facade to anyone approaching from downtown, the direction from which most guests would arrive. The building would rise 18 stories at its tallest point, making it one of the highest structures in that part of the city. The steel frame would support elaborate exterior ornamentation without the need for load-bearing walls. This allowed for larger windows and more flexible interior layouts than older buildings could achieve. French doors would open onto iron balconies, giving guests direct access to fresh air and park views. Demolition of the original plaza began in 1905. Crews dismantled the 8-story building methodically, salvaging materials that could be reused and hauling away debris. The site cleared quickly. By late 1905, the land was empty, ready for new construction. The empty lot at Manhattan's most visible corner became a subject of speculation and anticipation. Everyone knew something extraordinary was coming. Few understood just how extraordinary it would be. Construction began in earnest in early 1906. The project would employ hundreds of workers at its peak. The foundation alone represented a massive undertaking. The builders had to excavate down to bedrock, removing thousands of cubic yards of soil and loose rock. Manhattan's bedrock lies relatively close to the surface in that area, which made construction easier than in other parts of the city. But the sheer scale of the project presented challenges. The foundation required pouring enormous amounts of concrete, creating a base that could support a steel frame and 18 stories of masonry, marble, and furnishings. The concrete work took months. Workers labored through the winter of 1906, fighting cold weather and the complications that came with such a massive project in the middle of a busy city. Materials had to be delivered by horse-drawn wagons navigating crowded streets. Equipment had to be hoisted into position using manual labor and basic machinery. The steel frame began rising in the spring of 1906. This was the skeleton that would support everything else. Steel beams were riveted together in a process that was still relatively new in American construction. Workers heated rivets until they were red hot, then drove them through pre-drilled holes in the steel beams. As the rivets cooled, they contracted, pulling the beams together with tremendous force. The sound of riveting hammers echoed across that corner of Manhattan for months, announcing that something significant was taking shape. By mid-1906, the steel frame was visible for miles. New Yorkers could watch the building rising week by week, floor by floor. Newspapers covered the construction progress. Society pages speculated about when the hotel would open and what it would mean for New York's social landscape. The anticipation built as the structure grew taller. Hardenberg's design called for the exterior to be clad in white brick, manufactured specifically for the project. The bricks came from New York, but the marble trim came from quarries in Italy, France, and Vermont. Banneker insisted on the finest materials regardless of origin. If Italian marble was superior, then Italian marble would be used. If French limestone was more beautiful, it would be imported. Cost was not a limiting factor. The terracotta ornamentation presented particular challenges. Terracotta is molded clay that's fired at high temperatures, creating decorative elements that are both durable and relatively lightweight compared to carved stone. Hardenberg designed elaborate terracotta details for the building's exterior, including decorative cornices, window surrounds, and the ornate mansard roofs that would top each wing of the building. These terracotta elements were manufactured by the Atlantic Terracotta Company in New York, but the designs required highly skilled craftsmen. Each piece had to be molded, fired, and then installed with precision. The mansard roofs alone contained thousands of individual terracotta tiles, each one contributing to the overall visual effect. The work was painstaking and expensive, but the result would be spectacular. As the exterior took shape through late 1906 and early 1907, attention shifted to the interiors. This is where Beinecke's vision became truly extravagant. He had studied the great hotels of Europe during research trips. He had stayed at the Ritz in Paris, the Savoy in London, and the grand hotels of Vienna and Budapest. He understood that European hotels set standards that American establishments struggled to match. The new plaza would change that. The public spaces received the most elaborate treatment. Hardenberg worked with a team of interior designers and craftsmen to create rooms that would impress even the most jaded European aristocrat. The main lobby was designed as a grand entrance hall, with marble floors, ornate plaster ceilings, and crystal chandeliers that would be visible from the Fifth Avenue entrance. Guests arriving at the plaza would immediately understand they had entered somewhere extraordinary. The Palm Court was conceived as the hotel's social center, a space where guests could gather for tea, light meals, and conversation. The room featured a stained glass ceiling designed by Donald MacDonald, rising 3 stories above the floor. The ceiling depicted an elaborate pattern in shades of amber, gold, and cream, allowing natural light to filter through while creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. Marble columns supported arches decorated with gold leaf. The furniture was custom designed, upholstered in fabrics imported from France. The Grand Ballroom occupied a prominent position in the building, designed to host the largest and most important social events. The room measured approximately 60 feet by 80 feet, with ceilings rising 24 feet overhead. The walls were paneled in mahogany and decorated with carved details and gold leaf accents. Crystal chandeliers hung at intervals across the ceiling, providing illumination for evening events. The floor was hardwood, polished to a mirror finish suitable for dancing. The Oak Room was designed specifically as a gentleman's bar and restaurant. The name came from the dark oak paneling that covered the walls from floor to ceiling. The wood had been imported from Europe, selected for its rich color and fine grain. Leather furniture and dark carpets created an atmosphere reminiscent of an English gentleman's club. The room was intended as a masculine space where men could retreat for drinks and cigars, separate from the more public areas where women would be present. The Rose Room, later renamed, was conceived as a formal dining room decorated in a lighter, more feminine style. The walls were covered in silk fabric in shades of rose and cream. The ceiling featured painted murals depicting classical scenes. The room was designed to appeal to society women hosting luncheons and afternoon gatherings, providing an alternative to the more formal grand ballroom for smaller events. Beyond the public spaces, the guest rooms required equally careful attention. The new plaza would contain approximately 800 rooms, a staggering number that required meticulous planning. Each room needed furniture, carpets, curtains, lighting fixtures, and countless other details. More importantly, Beinecke insisted that every room have a private bathroom, a luxury that many New York homes still lacked in 1907. The bathroom requirement significantly complicated construction. Each bathroom needed plumbing for water supply and waste removal. The building required enormous water tanks on the upper floors to maintain pressure throughout the structure. Hot water had to be available at all times, requiring boilers in the basement and insulated pipes running through the building. The mechanical systems necessary to support 800 private bathrooms represented a significant engineering challenge. Beinecke also insisted on other modern conveniences. Every room would have electric lighting, still relatively new in 1907. The building would have its own electrical generating system in the basement, providing power independent of the city's sometimes unreliable electrical grid. Every room would have a telephone, allowing guests to contact the front desk or make outside calls. These features seem basic today, but in 1907, they represented cutting-edge luxury. The kitchen facilities required special attention. The plaza would need to serve meals to hundreds of guests simultaneously, while also preparing food for banquets and private events. The kitchens occupied enormous space in the basement, equipped with ranges, ovens, refrigeration equipment, and storage areas for food and supplies. Beinecke hired a renowned chef from Europe and gave him authority to specify exactly what equipment the kitchens would need. The project was bleeding money at an alarming rate. Beinecke's initial budget had estimated total construction costs at approximately $8 million. By mid-1907, expenses had climbed past $12 million, with work still ongoing. The marble, the chandeliers, the furniture, the mechanical systems, every element was more expensive than projected. Beinecke's syndicate partners grew nervous. They had invested substantial sums expecting a reasonable return. The plaza was beginning to look like it might never generate enough revenue to justify its cost. Beinecke assured them the investment would pay off. The plaza would command room rates higher than any competitor. The prestige of staying there would attract the wealthiest guests from America and Europe. The hotel would fill with permanent residents who would pay premium prices for the privilege of a plaza address. The banquet business alone would generate substantial revenue. The numbers would work once the building opened and guests experienced what they were getting for their money. His reassurances were tested by forces beyond his control. In October 1907, just as the plaza was preparing to open, panic struck Wall Street. Stock prices collapsed. Banks failed. Credit froze. The Panic of 1907 was one of the most severe financial crises in American history, destroying fortunes and triggering a severe recession. The wealthy families who would have been the plaza's primary customers were scrambling to preserve their holdings, not planning luxury vacations. But the opening was scheduled. The building was complete. The staff had been hired and trained. Backing out was impossible. On October 1, 1907, the Plaza Hotel officially opened for business. The timing could not have been worse. Beinecke had invited New York society to tour the new hotel on opening night. They came despite the financial crisis, perhaps seeking distraction from the economic catastrophe unfolding around them. Women wore their finest evening gowns. Men appeared in white tie and tails. They walked through the marble corridors and elaborate public rooms, marveling at what Beinecke had created. The newspapers the next morning were unanimous in their praise. The New York Times called the Plaza the finest hotel in the world, noting that nothing in Europe surpassed it. The Tribune praised the architecture and the attention to detail. The world focused on the luxury, describing the gold leaf, the imported marble, and the crystal chandeliers in breathless prose. Every review emphasized that the plaza represented New York's arrival as a world capital equal to any city in Europe. But praise doesn't pay bills. The economic crisis meant that occupancy rates started far below projections. Wealthy families who might have stayed at the plaza were instead selling assets and cutting expenses. Business travelers postponed trips. The hotel had hundreds of empty rooms every night, each one representing lost revenue that wouldn't help cover the crushing debt Beinecke had accumulated during construction. Fred Sterry became the plaza's first general manager, a position that would define both his career and the hotel's character for decades. Sterry had previously managed the Homestead Resort in Hot Springs, Virginia, where he had earned a reputation for understanding luxury hospitality. He knew how to create the kind of service that wealthy guests expected, and he understood that running a hotel like the Plaza required more than just competent management. It required creating a social institution. Sterry implemented systems that would define the plaza for generations. He established strict dress codes that were enforced consistently but quietly. Gentlemen were expected to wear jackets and ties in public areas. Ladies needed to dress appropriately for the time of day. Children were discouraged in certain spaces. These rules were never posted or publicly announced. Guests were simply expected to know them, and staff would gently correct anyone who didn't. He created an elaborate hierarchy among the staff. Doormen greeted arriving guests with military precision. Their uniforms designed to communicate both authority and service. Bellhops carried luggage according to strict protocols, ensuring that valuable items were handled appropriately and guests never felt their possessions were at risk. Maids cleaned rooms to standards that most hotels didn't bother pursuing, with particular attention to details that guests would notice, even if subconsciously. The plaza employed over 1,500 staff members at peak times, an enormous workforce that required careful management. Sterry organized them into departments with clear chains of command. The kitchen staff alone numbered in the hundreds, including chefs trained in classical French techniques, sous chefs who supervised meal preparation, and an army of cooks, dishwashers, and kitchen workers who made it possible to serve hundreds of meals simultaneously. The front desk staff became experts at recognizing important guests and ensuring they received appropriate attention. Sterry insisted that his employees memorize the names and preferences of regular visitors. If Mrs. Vanderbilt arrived without notice, the staff was expected to greet her by name and have her usual suite ready within the hour. If a diplomat or business leader checked in, Sterry wanted to know immediately so he could personally welcome them. Sterry's pricing structure was deliberately exclusive. Room rates started at $250 per night for the smallest accommodations on the upper floors, rooms with limited views and minimal amenities. The best suites cost $35 per night, an astronomical sum when the average American worker earned less than $500 per year. Some permanent residents paid more than $1,000 per month for their plaza accommodations, spending more on housing than most families earned in 2 years. The message was clear. The plaza was not for everyone. It was for people who could afford the best and expected nothing less. Sterry understood that exclusivity itself had value. By making the plaza expensive and imposing social standards on guests, he created demand among people who wanted to prove they belonged in that world. Despite the financial panic, guests began coming. John Jacob Astor IV kept a permanent suite at the plaza, dividing his time between there and his mansion further up Fifth Avenue. The Vanderbilt family stayed regularly, with different family members maintaining rooms or suites as needed. The Goulds, the Whitneys, the Morgans, all of New York's great fortunes were represented among the plaza's early guests. European aristocrats visiting America chose the plaza as their New York base. Titled families from Britain, France, and Germany stayed there when conducting business or simply touring the United States. The hotel became an informal gathering place for international elites, a location where American industrial magnates could mix with European nobility in an atmosphere of mutual respect and shared privilege. The public spaces quickly became stages for social ritual. The Palm Court hosted afternoon tea, a tradition that Manhattan society adopted with enthusiasm. Women gathered there wearing their finest afternoon clothes, the latest Paris fashions, elaborate hats, and jewelry that would be vulgar in less rarefied settings. They sipped tea, ate delicate pastries, and gossiped about engagements, scandals, and the complex social hierarchies that governed their lives. The Oak Room filled with men conducting business over drinks and cigars. Sterry had stocked the bar with the finest liquors available, though prohibition was still years away. Businessmen negotiated deals in the leather chairs. Bankers discussed loans and investments. Politicians held quiet meetings away from public scrutiny. The Oak Room became known as a place where important conversations happened, where decisions were made that would affect millions of dollars and thousands of lives. The Grand Ballroom hosted the events that defined New York's social calendar. Debutante balls introduced young women to society, elaborate affairs where families demonstrated their wealth and status. Charity galas raised money for approved causes, allowing society matrons to perform philanthropy while wearing their best jewelry. Wedding receptions celebrated marriages that united prominent families, cementing social and sometimes business alliances. Sterry understood that he was orchestrating social theater, not just running a hotel. Every event at the Plaza followed unwritten rules that everyone in that world understood. The right people were invited. The wrong people were quietly excluded. Seating arrangements reflected careful consideration of social hierarchies and personal relationships. Nothing was left to chance. The hotel established protocols that guests were expected to follow, though these expectations were communicated through subtle signals rather than explicit rules. You didn't arrive in the Palm Court before 4 p.m. for tea. You didn't wear business clothes to dinner in the Rose Room. You didn't bring children to the Oak Room under any circumstances. These weren't written down anywhere, but everyone who belonged knew them, and people who didn't belong revealed themselves through small violations. Within 2 years, despite the ongoing economic difficulties following the 1907 panic, the Plaza had established itself as the center of New York social life. When wealthy families came to the city from their country estates in the Hudson Valley or on Long Island, many chose to keep apartments at the Plaza rather than maintain separate townhouses. The convenience was obvious. All meals were prepared by professional chefs. Cleaning and maintenance were handled by hotel staff. Social opportunities were literally down the hallway or elevator ride away. Some residents lived at the Plaza year-round, treating it as their primary home. They furnished their suites with personal possessions, art, and furniture. They hosted private dinners in their rooms or reserved the hotel's private dining rooms for entertaining. They became part of the permanent community that gave the Plaza its distinctive character, a mix of visitors and residents, temporary guests, and people who considered the hotel their true home. George M. Cohan, the famous Broadway composer and performer, kept a suite at the Plaza for years. Cohan wrote some of his most famous songs while living at the hotel, including "Give My Regards to Broadway" and "You're a Grand Old Flag." The piano in his suite became legendary, and other artists and performers would visit to hear Cohan work through new compositions. The Plaza attracted creative people who appreciated the energy and sophistication of living in the city's premier hotel. But behind the glamour and social success, the economics remained deeply problematic. The construction debt was crushing. Beinecke and his syndicate partners had borrowed heavily to finance the project, and the loan payments demanded more cash than the hotel could generate, even with improving occupancy rates. Room revenue, even at premium prices, wasn't enough. Banquet income helped, but didn't close the gap. The Plaza was famous, prestigious, and financially underwater. Beinecke spent years trying to make the numbers work. He refinanced debt when possible. He pushed Sterry to increase occupancy and raise rates. He looked for ways to cut costs without diminishing the quality that made the Plaza special. Nothing worked. The hotel needed to generate more revenue or find new ownership willing to absorb the losses. By 1909, just 2 years after opening, rumors circulated through Manhattan that the Plaza might be sold. Beinecke denied them publicly, insisting the hotel was successful and he had no intention of selling. Privately, he was desperately seeking buyers who would take the property off his hands before the debt destroyed him personally. Several potential purchasers expressed interest, but when they reviewed the financial statements, they walked away. The plaza was too expensive to maintain. The debt was too large. The return on investment wasn't there. The savior came from an unexpected direction. Not a hotelier, not someone experienced in luxury hospitality, but a businessman who saw the plaza as something other than a financial investment. Harry S. Black was president of the Fuller Company, one of the largest and most successful construction firms in America. Fuller had built the Flatiron Building, the distinctive triangular skyscraper at Broadway and Fifth Avenue that had become an instant icon of New York architecture. Black had grown wealthy from construction, but he wanted something more than money. He wanted status. He wanted to be recognized as a member of New York's elite, not just a businessman who built things for other people. Owning the plaza would give him that recognition. The hotel was already established as the symbol of New York sophistication. Whoever controlled it controlled access to that world. In 1909, Black purchased the Plaza Hotel for $12.5 million. The price exceeded what Beinecke and his partners had spent on construction, allowing them to escape without total financial ruin. Black assumed all existing debt and committed to maintaining the property's luxury standards. The transaction was announced in newspapers across the country. Black wasn't just buying a hotel, he was buying a throne at the center of American society. Under Black's ownership, the plaza solidified its reputation as the nation's preeminent luxury hotel. Black understood that the building's value lay not in occupancy rates or revenue per room, but in its role at the center of American wealth and power. He was willing to accept losses if necessary to maintain that position. The prestige mattered more than the profit. Black had the financial resources to absorb the plaza's continuing deficits. The Fuller Company was generating substantial revenue from construction projects across the country. Black could afford to treat the plaza as a trophy rather than a business, something that Beinecke and his syndicate partners had never been able to do. The hotel finally had an owner whose primary concern wasn't making it profitable. He invested in improvements and renovations. When maintenance was needed, Black authorized the work without quibbling about costs. When Sterry requested funds for upgrading facilities or adding amenities, Black approved the spending. He wanted the plaza to remain the finest hotel in America, and he understood that maintaining that standard required continuous investment. The guest list during the 1910s demonstrated the plaza's centrality to American power. Theodore Roosevelt kept a suite for his New York visits, using it as a base for meetings with supporters and political allies. Roosevelt had left the presidency in 1909, but remained enormously influential in Republican politics. His presence at the plaza brought other politicians and journalists to the hotel, creating an informal political salon in the public rooms and private suites. William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's successor as president, held court in the Oak Room when visiting New York. Taft was a massive man, over 300 pounds, and required specially reinforced furniture. The plaza accommodated his needs without comment, demonstrating the level of customized service the hotel provided to important guests. When Taft's presidency ended in 1913, he continued using the plaza for New York visits, establishing a pattern that other ex-presidents would follow. Woodrow Wilson attended events in the Grand Ballroom both before and during his presidency. Wilson's appearances at plaza events signaled the hotel's status as an appropriate venue for presidential activities. When foreign dignitaries visited the United States, the State Department directed them to the plaza as the most suitable accommodation in New York. Ambassadors, prime ministers, and occasionally royalty stayed there, knowing the hotel would provide security, discretion, and service equal to what they experienced in their own countries. The hotel's restaurants became legendary destinations in their own right. The Rose Room, with its pink silk walls and elaborate decor, served multi-course meals prepared by chefs trained in classical French techniques. A formal dinner at the Plaza could last 3 hours, with course after course emerging from the kitchens downstairs. Guests might start with oysters or caviar, proceed through soup, fish, meat courses, possibly game, then finish with elaborate desserts and coffee. The meals were performances, demonstrating both the chef's skill and the diner's sophistication in knowing how to navigate such complexity. The grill room offered a more casual atmosphere, but still maintained Plaza standards. It became popular for business lunches, where deals were negotiated over roast beef and potatoes. The terrace room overlooked Central Park and served as a venue for private parties and wedding receptions. Each restaurant had its own character and clientele, allowing the Plaza to serve different purposes for different occasions. The staff became experts at managing the complex social dynamics that played out within the hotel's walls. They knew which guests were feuding and needed to be seated apart in restaurants. They understood which families had suffered financial reversals during market downturns and required extra discretion. They recognized which young women were being introduced to society and needed to be treated with special care. Their real job wasn't just providing service, but managing relationships, navigating the subtle hierarchies and rules that governed the world their guests inhabited. When World War I began in Europe in 1914, the Plaza initially benefited from disruptions to European travel. Wealthy Americans who might have spent time in Paris or London stayed home instead, and many chose the Plaza for their New York visits. The hotel filled with guests who couldn't pursue their usual patterns and needed alternatives. Sterry adapted the social calendar, creating events and programs that would appeal to guests spending longer periods at the hotel. But as America moved closer to entering the war, the atmosphere changed. Many wealthy families had sons who enlisted or were drafted. The mood became more somber. Elaborate social events seemed inappropriate when American soldiers were dying in France. The Plaza continued operating, but the character of activities shifted. Fewer debutante balls, more fundraisers for war relief. The Grand Ballroom hosted events selling war bonds rather than celebrating engagements. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the Plaza actively supported the war effort. Black authorized use of the Grand Ballroom for Red Cross fundraisers without charging the organization. Sterry organized events that raised substantial sums for military hospitals and relief organizations. The hotel became a gathering place for committees coordinating civilian war support, with women's groups meeting in private dining rooms to organize bandage rolling and care package preparation. The war also brought challenges to hotel operations. Staff members enlisted or were drafted, creating labor shortages that Sterry struggled to fill. Food supplies became less reliable as agriculture shifted toward military needs. Fuel shortages during harsh winters made heating the enormous building difficult. But the Plaza adapted, maintaining standards even as circumstances became more difficult. Harry Black saw the hotel through the war years, but he suffered personal tragedies that would eventually destroy him. His wife Isabel died suddenly in 1918. Black was devastated. He had built his life around achieving recognition in New York society, and Isabel had been his partner in that pursuit. Without her, the accomplishments felt hollow. His mental health deteriorated over the following decade, leading to depression that would ultimately prove fatal. The 1920s brought prosperity that exceeded anything America had experienced before. The economy boomed, the stock market climbed relentlessly. Fortunes were made with stunning speed, and the newly wealthy wanted to spend their money in places that announced their success. The plaza was perfectly positioned to capitalize on this prosperity. But the 1920s also brought prohibition. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. By January 1920, it was illegal to serve alcohol in hotels, restaurants, or any public establishment. The Oak Room, famous for its bar, officially served only legal beverages, which meant nothing stronger than fruit juice and soda. Unofficially, the plaza adapted to the new reality as smoothly as every other aspect of New York society. Guests who wanted cocktails could find them, though the hotel maintained careful deniability. Staff might suggest nearby speakeasies. Certain trusted employees could arrange for bottles to be delivered to guest rooms. The plaza never openly violated prohibition, but it didn't allow the law to interfere with guest satisfaction either. Sterry navigated these contradictions with the same discretion he applied to everything else. He understood that many plaza guests considered prohibition an absurd imposition on their freedom. They had no intention of giving up alcohol simply because the government had passed a law. Sterry's job was to help them maintain their preferred lifestyle while keeping the hotel out of legal trouble. He accomplished this through careful management and deliberately vague policies that gave staff flexibility to serve guests without creating documentation. The era also brought new types of guests who would have been unusual before the war. The 1920s created enormous wealth for people who didn't come from established families. Bootleggers made fortunes selling illegal alcohol. Stock speculators turned small investments into millions. Entrepreneurs built businesses in new industries like automobiles, radio, and motion pictures. This new money was rawer than old Vanderbilt and Astor fortunes, less concerned with social niceties, more interested in demonstrating success through conspicuous spending. Sterry welcomed them, understanding that the plaza needed paying guests more than it needed to maintain rigid social barriers. If the new millionaires lacked polish, the hotel would provide it. Many of these men and their families eventually became fixtures of New York society, their rough edges worn smooth by years of exposure to plaza standards and the social lessons absorbed from observing established families. The plaza became a symbol of the Jazz Age. F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose novels defined the era, set scenes from his work in the hotel. In The Great Gatsby, characters visit the plaza for a crucial confrontation scene. Fitzgerald understood that his readers would immediately understand what it meant for his characters to be at the plaza. The location communicated wealth, sophistication, and the peculiar mixture of possibility and corruption that characterized the 1920s. The hotel appeared in other novels, plays, and eventually movies. To say someone stayed at the plaza conveyed everything about their status without needing additional explanation. The building had transcended being merely a hotel and become a cultural icon, recognized across America and increasingly around the world. The permanent resident population grew during the 1920s as more families chose to live at the plaza year-round. Some occupied multiple suites, creating elaborate apartments within the hotel. They furnished these spaces with personal collections of art and antiques. They employed their own staff in addition to hotel employees. For them, the plaza was home in every meaningful sense, offering both privacy and access to the social world that gathered in the public spaces. But behind the prosperity and glamour, Harry Black was falling apart. His depression had deepened through the decade. He became increasingly erratic in business decisions. He withdrew from social activities. The plaza that he had purchased as a path to social acceptance now felt like a burden, a constant reminder of his isolation and unhappiness. On December 2, 1930, just over a year after the stock market crash that ended the boom years, Harry Black shot himself at his home in Atlantic City. He was 60 years old. His suicide shocked New York society, though close friends had seen the warning signs. Black had achieved everything he sought: wealth, recognition, ownership of America's premier hotel, but none of it had brought him peace. His widow sold the plaza in 1933 to a group of investors for $7.5 million, less than half what Black had paid 24 years earlier. The Depression had devastated real estate values across the country. Even prestigious properties like the Plaza were selling at massive discounts. The new owners faced a situation that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier: a nearly empty luxury hotel in a city where millions were unemployed and desperate. The Great Depression destroyed the economic foundation that supported the plaza. The wealthy families who had kept permanent suites were gone. Their fortunes evaporated in the market collapse. Corporate executives who had stayed at the hotel for business trips had been fired or were traveling on drastically reduced budgets. European visitors disappeared as economic crisis engulfed the entire industrialized world. Room rates had to be slashed, sometimes to a third of previous levels, just to attract any guests at all. The staff was reduced dramatically. Hundreds of employees were laid off as occupancy plummeted. Services that had defined the plaza were curtailed or eliminated entirely. The Palm Court continued serving tea, but with far fewer customers and simpler menus. The restaurants struggled to fill tables. The grand ballroom sat dark most nights, without the charity galas and debutante balls that had once filled the social calendar. Yet somehow, against all logic, the plaza survived the Depression. It survived because even in the depths of economic catastrophe, some people still had money, and those people still needed somewhere to stay when they came to New York. Hollywood celebrities visiting for movie premieres chose the Plaza because no other hotel carried the same prestige. Politicians attending conventions stayed there because it communicated that they were serious people who had achieved success. Business executives who had navigated the Depression without losing everything wanted accommodations that reflected their survival. The hotel limped through the 1930s, never filling, never profitable, but never quite failing either. The owners did the minimum necessary maintenance. They kept the building open and functioning. They waited for economic conditions to improve, knowing that if they could survive until prosperity returned, the plaza's prestige would reassert its value. World War II brought new challenges and opportunities. As the economy finally recovered with wartime production, business travel increased. Military officers passed through New York on their way to European or Pacific deployments. Defense contractors negotiated deals in the city. Government officials coordinated war efforts from offices in Manhattan. All of them needed accommodations, and many chose the plaza despite wartime austerity. The hotel adapted its operations to wartime restrictions. Food rationing meant simpler menus in the restaurants. Fuel shortages required lowering heating temperatures in winter. Blackout curtains had to be installed in rooms facing Fifth Avenue to comply with air raid precautions. Staff shortages continued as employees joined the military or moved to higher-paying defense industry jobs. But the plaza remained open, serving guests through the most destructive war in human history. Conrad Hilton had been watching the plaza for years, waiting for the right moment to acquire it. Hilton had started with a single hotel in Texas in 1919 and built an empire through the Depression by purchasing distressed properties at bargain prices. He understood real estate cycles better than almost anyone in the hospitality industry. He knew that prestigious properties bought during downturns would generate enormous returns when economic conditions improved. The Plaza represented the crown jewel of American hotels, and Hilton wanted it. In 1943, while the war still raged across Europe and the Pacific, Hilton purchased the Plaza for $7.4 million. The price was astonishingly low compared to what the property had sold for in better times, but wartime uncertainty depressed values across the real estate market. Hilton didn't care. He was buying the most famous hotel in America, and he was getting it at a price that made the acquisition nearly risk-free. Hilton brought a completely different management philosophy to the Plaza. Where previous owners had treated it as a social institution that happened to be a business, Hilton treated it as a business that happened to be socially prestigious. He installed modern management techniques that emphasized efficiency and cost control. He analyzed occupancy rates and adjusted pricing to maximize revenue. He scrutinized every department, looking for ways to cut expenses without compromising service quality. Some longtime guests were horrified. They complained that Hilton was destroying what made the Plaza special, that he was running it like a commercial enterprise rather than a private club. Letters to newspapers lamented the changes. Society matrons who had hosted events at the Plaza for decades threatened to take their business elsewhere. But Hilton understood something they refused to acknowledge. The Plaza had been losing money for years. Prestige without profit was just expensive pretension, and it was unsustainable. He invested substantial sums in renovations that had been deferred during the Depression and war years. Rooms were updated with modern bathrooms and new furnishings. The mechanical systems that kept the building functioning were repaired or replaced. The kitchen equipment was modernized. Hilton spent millions improving the property while simultaneously cutting operational costs that had been bloated by decades of overstaffing and inefficiency. The approach was vindicated by the post-war economic boom. American prosperity reached unprecedented levels. A new middle class emerged with money to spend on travel and entertainment. Business travel exploded as corporations expanded domestically and internationally. International visitors returned to New York in growing numbers as commercial aviation made travel faster and easier. The Plaza filled with guests again, and this time the operation was profitable in ways it had never been under previous ownership. The 1950s were the Plaza's golden age of celebrity culture. The hotel had always attracted famous guests, but the rise of mass media transformed celebrity into something different. Movie stars, musicians, and television personalities had fame that reached far beyond the society pages that covered old money families. These celebrities chose the Plaza because it offered both luxury and security, a place where they could stay in comfort while having some protection from fans and reporters. Marilyn Monroe lived at the Plaza for extended periods while filming movies in New York. She kept a suite and treated the hotel as her home base, appreciating both the service and the discretion the staff provided. Frank Sinatra maintained rooms at the Plaza and used them for meetings, rehearsals, and the elaborate social life he conducted in the city. The Beatles stayed at the hotel during their first American tour in February 1964, causing riots outside as thousands of fans tried to reach their idols. The police had to barricade Fifth Avenue to control the crowds. The Hilton era also brought social changes that longtime observers found unsettling. In 1955, after years of pressure, the Oak Room began admitting women. The change seemed minor, but it represented a fundamental shift in the hotel's character. The Oak Room had been designed as a masculine space, a refuge where men could retreat from the mixed social world of the other public areas. Opening it to women meant acknowledging that the rigid gender separations of earlier eras were becoming outdated. Dress codes relaxed slightly, though the plaza remained more formal than most hotels. Guests were still expected to dress appropriately, but appropriately was defined less strictly than under Fred Sterry's management. The hotel remained elegant and exclusive, but Hilton recognized that American society was becoming more casual, and the plaza needed to adapt or risk becoming irrelevant to younger generations of wealthy travelers. Hilton had proven that the plaza could be profitable with proper management, but in 1953 he decided to sell. He had achieved what he wanted, owning and operating the most famous hotel in America. Now he wanted to realize his profit and invest in other properties. He sold the plaza to A.M. Sonnabend, a Boston developer who had been assembling a portfolio of luxury hotels for $15 million. Hilton had more than doubled his money in 10 years, while also drawing profits from operations. Sonnabend believed he could push the plaza to even higher profitability. He expanded the banquet business aggressively, marketing the grand ballroom and other event spaces to corporations and wealthy families planning weddings. He raised room rates to premium levels, reasoning that guests would pay more for the prestige of staying at the plaza. He pushed occupancy higher through aggressive marketing that emphasized the hotel's famous history and celebrity guests. The approach worked financially. Revenue climbed steadily through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. The plaza generated profits that previous owners would have considered impossible. But something intangible was lost in the process. The hotel that had once been exclusive was now merely expensive. Anyone with money could stay there. The subtle social standards that had defined the plaza under Sterry's management had been replaced by simpler calculations based on ability to pay. Guests who remembered earlier eras complained that the plaza had lost its soul. It looked the same. The Palm Court still served tea, the Grand Ballroom still hosted elegant events, but it felt different. More commercial, less special. The difference was difficult to articulate, but undeniable to anyone who had experienced the plaza in its earlier incarnations. Sonnabend didn't particularly care about these complaints. He was operating a successful business. The hotel filled rooms, served meals, hosted events, and generated substantial profits. If some society matrons preferred the past, that was nostalgia, not a business strategy. The plaza was thriving by any objective measure, and Sonnabend had no intention of sacrificing profitability to preserve outdated social standards. The hotel continued changing hands through the 1970s and 1980s as different investors sought to own the iconic property. Westin Hotels purchased the plaza in 1975 as part of a broader strategy to establish a presence in New York luxury hospitality. Westin understood they were buying a property that required continuous, significant investment, but they believed the prestige and location justified the expense. Westin invested heavily in renovations that were desperately needed. The building was nearly 70 years old. The mechanical systems that heated and cooled the building, provided hot water, and powered the elevators were aging and increasingly unreliable. The plumbing in many rooms needed complete replacement. The electrical systems required updating to handle modern demands. The work cost tens of millions of dollars, but without it, the plaza would have deteriorated into an unusable relic. The guest rooms received particular attention. Westin updated bathrooms with modern fixtures while trying to maintain historical character. They replaced furniture, carpets, and curtains that had aged beyond acceptable standards. They installed air conditioning systems that could keep rooms comfortable even during hot New York summers. The goal was modernization, without sacrificing the elegant atmosphere that made the plaza special. The renovations were mostly successful, though purists complained that some historical details were lost in the modernization. Original bathroom tiles were replaced with new materials. Some decorative plasterwork was simplified during ceiling repairs. The changes were subtle, but they represented ongoing erosion of the original Hardenberg vision. Each renovation cycle made the plaza slightly less like the 1907 original and slightly more like a modern luxury hotel that happened to occupy a historic building. Through the 1980s, the plaza remained iconic but increasingly challenged by new competition. Other luxury hotels were opening in Manhattan, offering comparable or superior amenities in more modern buildings. The Four Seasons opened in 1993 with cutting-edge luxury. The St. Regis, the plaza's old rival, underwent massive renovations that brought it to contemporary standards. Guests choosing hotels based purely on amenities and service rather than history found alternatives that might serve them better. Then, in 1988, Donald Trump entered the picture, buying the Plaza at the peak of his 1980s prominence. Trump was 42 years old, at the absolute height of his fame and apparent success. Trump Tower, completed in 1983, had made him a Manhattan celebrity. His name was appearing on buildings across the city. He owned 3 Atlantic City casinos that seemed to be generating enormous cash. He was everywhere in New York media, cultivating an image as the ultimate successful businessman. When the Plaza came on the market in 1988, Trump saw it as the ultimate trophy, the most famous hotel in America, and he wanted to own it. He paid $407.5 million for the Plaza in June 1988. The price shattered all records for hotel purchases. Financial analysts immediately questioned the valuation. They examined occupancy rates, average room prices, operational costs, and couldn't understand how the purchase price could be justified. The Plaza was profitable, but not profitable enough to generate returns that would justify a $400 million investment. Trump didn't care about their analysis. He understood that owning the Plaza wasn't about cash flow or return on investment in any conventional sense. It was about owning a symbol. It was about being able to say he owned the most famous hotel in America. The prestige, the association with history and elegance, those intangible benefits were worth more to him than any financial return. At least that's what he told himself, and anyone who would listen. His wife, Ivana, took charge of renovations, spending $50 million on a project intended to restore the Plaza to something approaching its 1907 glory. She hired interior designers who specialized in historic preservation. She studied photographs and documents from the hotel's early years. The goal was to undo decades of compromises and modernizations that had gradually eroded the original character. The Palm Court received elaborate attention. The stained glass ceiling was cleaned and repaired, bringing back the golden glow that had dimmed over decades. The marble columns were restored. Original decorative elements that had been removed or covered during previous renovations were recreated based on historical records. When the work was complete, the Palm Court looked closer to Hardenberg's original vision than it had in generations. The Grand Ballroom underwent similar treatment. Original paint colors were identified through analysis of multiple layers of accumulated finishes. Decorative plasterwork was repaired or recreated where pieces had been damaged. The crystal chandeliers were disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled with missing elements replaced. The goal was authentic restoration rather than modernization, bringing back details that had been lost or obscured over 80 years of use. Guest rooms were renovated with an emphasis on luxury rather than historical accuracy. Trump wanted rooms that would justify premium pricing. Bathrooms were completely redone with marble and gold fixtures. Furnishings were upgraded to contemporary luxury standards. The rooms looked expensive and elegant, but didn't particularly reflect the 1907 originals, which had been far more modest. The restoration work earned recognition from preservation organizations. The quality of craftsmanship was undeniable. Ivana had demonstrated genuine commitment to respecting the building's history while adapting it for modern use. But the economic fundamentals remained disastrous. Trump had borrowed heavily to finance the purchase. The debt service on $400 million was crushing. Even with the renovations complete and room rates at premium levels, the plaza couldn't generate enough cash flow to cover the loan payments. Trump was hemorrhaging money on a hotel he had dramatically overpaid for at the peak of a real estate market that was about to collapse. His Atlantic City casinos started failing. The cash flow he had counted on to support the plaza disappeared. By 1989, Trump was negotiating with creditors across his empire, trying to prevent a complete financial collapse. The plaza was one of several properties where he had taken on more debt than the assets could support. It was a spectacular example of 1980s excess, when borrowing seemed limitless and consequences seemed distant. By 1992, Trump was negotiating with his creditors to avoid personal bankruptcy. He gave up his majority stake in the plaza, retaining only a 49% interest and a management contract that allowed him to claim he still controlled the hotel. The banks that had loaned him money to purchase the plaza had effectively repossessed it. The hotel he had paid $400 million for had been taken away after just 4 years of ownership. Trump tried to spin the outcome as a strategic victory in his autobiography, claiming he had structured the deal deliberately and come out ahead. Nobody who looked at the actual numbers believed him. He had lost hundreds of millions of dollars on the plaza in a transaction that perfectly exemplified the financial recklessness of the late 1980s. In 1995, Trump sold his remaining interest completely. The plaza changed hands again, this time to Kwek Leng Beng and his company CDL Hotels International from Singapore for $325 million. Kwek had experience operating luxury hotels in Asia and believed he could make the plaza profitable through careful management and strategic positioning. He spent several years operating the hotel conventionally, but eventually recognized that the fundamental economics didn't work. The plaza was expensive to maintain. The building's age meant constant repairs. The mechanical systems required ongoing attention. The staff needed to maintain service standards was larger than modern luxury hotels required. Even with high occupancy rates and premium room prices, the revenues couldn't cover costs and generate acceptable returns on the investment. Kwek eventually reached the same conclusion that previous owners should have acknowledged decades earlier. The plaza couldn't survive as a traditional hotel. The building was too expensive to maintain. The operational costs were too high. The business model didn't work and never had. Something fundamental needed to change, or the plaza would continue to be a financial drain on whoever owned it. The solution was radical. Convert much of the hotel into private condominiums. Wealthy buyers would pay premium prices to own an apartment at the plaza, generating substantial capital that could offset years of operational losses. The building would maintain some hotel rooms to preserve its historic character, but most of the space would become luxury residential units. The idea wasn't entirely new. Other landmark hotels in Manhattan had undergone similar conversions, transforming from pure hotels into mixed-use buildings with both hotel and residential components. The plaza was more famous than those other properties, which meant the conversion would be more controversial, but the economic logic was undeniable. The conversion required approval from multiple government bodies. The plaza had been designated a New York City landmark in 1969, which meant any significant changes required permission from the Landmarks Preservation Commission. The commission's job was protecting historically significant buildings from inappropriate modifications. Converting a hotel into condominiums clearly constituted a significant change. Preservationists mobilized to fight the plan. They argued that the plaza was important precisely because it was a hotel, not just because of its architecture. The building's role in New York's social and cultural life depended on it being a functioning hotel where people could stay, dine, and attend events. Converting it to private condominiums would destroy that public function, turning it into just another expensive residential building. The debate stretched across years, from 2005 through 2007. Public hearings generated passionate testimony from historians, architects, former guests, and concerned citizens. Some argued that the plaza's survival as a building mattered more than its function as a hotel. Others insisted that function and form were inseparable, that a plaza that wasn't primarily a hotel would cease to be the plaza in any meaningful sense. Finally, in 2007, the Landmarks Preservation Commission approved a compromise. The plaza could convert to mixed use, with residential condominiums occupying most of the building. But a significant number of hotel rooms would remain, ensuring the building retained its historic function, at least partially. The public spaces, the Palm Court, the Grand Ballroom, and other historically significant rooms would be preserved and remain accessible to the public for appropriate uses. The approved plan allowed for 282 hotel rooms and 181 residential condominiums. The hotel section would operate as a luxury property under established hotel brand management. The condominiums would be developed as some of the most expensive residential real estate in Manhattan. The compromise satisfied no one completely, but offered the best chance for the plaza to survive as both a historic building and an economically viable property. The conversion project cost approximately $400 million. Every residential unit was completely gutted, stripped down to the steel frame, and rebuilt as luxury apartments. The work revealed the building's age in uncomfortable ways. Plumbing and electrical systems that had been patched and extended over decades needed complete replacement. Structural elements required reinforcement to meet modern building codes. The renovation was more extensive and expensive than anyone had anticipated. The hotel section received similar treatment, though with different goals. Those rooms were renovated to contemporary five-star standards while preserving enough historic character to satisfy preservation requirements. The public spaces underwent careful restoration, bringing them back to something closer to their original condition. The Palm Court was again meticulously restored. The Grand Ballroom received new finishes that referenced historical colors and patterns. The condominiums went on sale in 2007 as the renovation neared completion. Prices ranged from $1.5 million for the smallest units to over $40 million for elaborate penthouses. The marketing emphasized not just the luxury of the apartments, but the prestige of owning property at the plaza. Buyers weren't just purchasing real estate, they were purchasing an address that carried more than a century of cultural significance. The apartments sold despite the astronomical prices. Wealthy buyers from around the world competed for units, seeing them as trophy properties. Some units were purchased by individuals who would actually live in them. Others were bought as investments or occasional use properties by people who wanted a Manhattan apartment but wouldn't occupy it full-time. The mix created a residential population very different from traditional apartment buildings. When the conversion was complete in 2008, the plaza had been transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable to Bernhard Beinecke or Fred Sterry. Most of the building was now private residential space, closed to the public and inaccessible to anyone who didn't own an apartment or know someone who did. The hotel component, while still substantial, was no longer the building's primary function. The transformation saved the plaza from demolition or continued financial failure, but at a cost. The building that had been a symbol of aspirational luxury, theoretically available to anyone who could afford a room, had become a fortress for the ultra-wealthy. The social function that had defined the plaza for a century had been fundamentally altered. Today, the plaza survives in this hybrid form. The hotel section operates under various luxury brand management, offering 282 rooms to guests willing to pay premium prices. Room rates typically start around $700 per night and climb into thousands for suites. The hotel attracts tourists seeking to experience a legendary property, business travelers who want the prestige, and occasional celebrities who appreciate the history and service. The Palm Court still serves afternoon tea, though at prices that would shock even the wealthy guests of 1907. A traditional afternoon tea service costs over $100 per person, positioning it as a special occasion rather than a regular social ritual. The room remains beautiful, the service is excellent, but the experience has become something you do once rather than a weekly habit. The Grand Ballroom continues hosting events, mostly weddings and corporate functions. A plaza wedding carries prestige that many couples find worth the substantial cost. The ballroom looks spectacular in photographs, providing a backdrop that communicates elegance and success. But the social calendar no longer includes the debutante balls and charity galas that once filled the space regularly. Those events happen elsewhere in the city, if they happen at all. The Oak Room closed in 2011, a victim of changing tastes and economic pressure. The dark wood paneling and leather furniture that had defined masculine elegance in 1907 felt dated in the 21st century. The room sat empty for years until it was converted to a different use. The space that had been central to the plaza's identity for over a century no longer exists in its original form. The building itself remains stunning from the outside. The white facade still rises above Fifth Avenue, commanding attention with its French Renaissance details. Central Park still spreads out before the entrance, exactly as Henry Hardenberg envisioned when he designed the building. From Fifth Avenue, the plaza looks permanent, unchangeable, eternal. Tourists still photograph it. Movies and television shows still use it as a symbol of New York luxury. But behind that facade lies a history of continuous financial struggle that began before the building even opened. Every owner, from Bernhard Beinecke to the current condominium board, has wrestled with the same problem. The plaza costs more to maintain than it can generate in revenue. It has been rescued repeatedly by new owners willing to lose money for prestige, by clever financial restructuring, by operational improvements, and finally by converting it into something fundamentally different from what it was built to be. The current plaza is not the hotel that opened in 1907. It's not the social institution that Fred Sterry managed through the 1910s and 20s. It's not the celebrity haven of the 1950s or the Trump restoration project of the late 1980s. It's a hybrid creation, part museum, part operating hotel, part luxury residential tower. It survives by being all of these things simultaneously, never quite satisfying anyone who remembers what it used to be, but existing when it might easily have been demolished decades ago. The building's cultural significance remains remarkably intact despite all the changes. The plaza still appears in movies and television shows as shorthand for luxury and sophistication. It still represents something important in the American imagination. children still read about Eloise, the fictional girl who lived at the hotel in Kay Thompson's famous books from the 1950s. Couples still dream of plaza weddings, even though few can afford them. The plaza has survived because it means something beyond its bricks and marble. It represents an idea about New York, about America, about what wealth can create when combined with ambition and vision. That idea has proven more durable than any ownership structure or business model. The building embodies a moment in American history when it seemed possible to build monuments to prosperity, when spending $12 million on a hotel didn't seem insane, when the future appeared unlimited and permanent. The story of the Plaza is ultimately the story of American ambition and excess. It's a building that never made economic sense, built by men who spent more than they should have, on a scale that couldn't be justified, to create something that would announce their importance to the world. They succeeded completely at that goal, and failed at almost everything else. Bernhard Beinecke died having lost a fortune on the Plaza. Harry Black survived long enough to own the hotel for 2 decades, but ended his life in despair and suicide. Conrad Hilton made money, but later admitted the property was more trouble than it was worth. Donald Trump lost hundreds of millions in one of the most spectacular real estate failures of the 1980s. Almost everyone who owned the Plaza paid dearly for the privilege. Yet the building remains. It remains because enough people across more than a century decided that the Plaza was worth saving, even when the numbers said otherwise. They believed that some things matter more than profit and loss statements. They believed that buildings can embody something important about who we are and what we value. They believed that certain symbols are worth preserving even at substantial cost. The Plaza was never meant to survive on purely economic terms. The business model was flawed from the beginning. The construction costs were too high. The operational expenses were too great. The revenue potential was never sufficient to justify the investment. By any rational analysis, the Plaza should have been demolished decades ago, the land repurposed for something more economically productive. But here it stands, 117 years after opening. Still commanding attention, still impressing visitors, still meaning something to millions of people who have never stayed there and never will. That stubborn survival is its own kind of triumph. A triumph of symbolism over economics, of cultural meaning over financial sense, of the idea that some things, once created, become more important than the calculations that should govern their existence. The Plaza Hotel was built to be the finest in the world. It achieved that goal on opening night in October 1907. And it has been paying the price for that achievement ever since. This is the cost of being iconic, the burden of representing something larger than yourself. The price of embodying an idea so powerful that it keeps you alive even when every practical consideration argues for your disappearance. The Plaza survives not because it makes sense, but because we need it to. We need the symbol. We need the reminder that America once built things simply because they were worth building, without worrying obsessively about whether they would generate acceptable returns. We need the evidence that ambition and vision can create something that outlasts its creators, that continues mattering long after everyone who built it is gone. That's the real story of the Plaza, not a story of financial success or failure, though it includes both in abundance. Not a story of famous guests and celebrity culture, though those elements are certainly present. It's a story about what happens when a building becomes more important than the economics that should govern its fate. What happens when a symbol proves more durable than the reality it symbolizes? The Plaza was never meant to last, but it refused to disappear. And in that refusal, it became something more than just a hotel. It became proof that sometimes the things we build mean more than we intend, that sometimes our creations outlive our purposes, that sometimes survival itself is the greatest achievement.